Chapter 1. Calvin Simpson leaned against his fence, looking out over his expanse of land. He'd finished the roundup and already received a good sum for his herd and long hours on the range. His herd was truly bountiful, and he was pleased to say he was in a better place than he'd envisioned at this point in his life. He was 35, which was older than he'd planned to be before marriage, but there were just no women to be found in the tiny little town of Pootville, Missouri. He'd been reluctant to send off for a mail-order bride until he felt like he was ready to support a family, but his bank statement was proof that it was time. He straightened and strode toward the house. He was going to sit down and write a letter before he lost his nerve. He walked into the house and pulled out a sheet of paper and a freshly sharpened pencil. Dear potential bride. My name is Calvin Simpson, and I own a small ranch outside of Pootville, Missouri. I have a few dairy cows for milk and a few chickens for eggs. What I don't have is a wife, and I hope that's where you come in. I'm 35 years old, and I like to take long walks in the evening before bed. I love to sing and spend half my time doing chores while I sing. I am tall and lanky. I'm not real particular on looks, so I'll be happy to love you no matter what you look like. I look forward to hearing your response. Sincerely, Calvin. Asterisk. It was mid-November before he got his response in the mail. Sniffing the letter, he wondered if his future bride had sprayed perfume on the letter as he'd heard women sometimes did. When there was no scent, he opened the letter and read it while still in town. He didn't care if anyone thought he was crazy sitting in his wagon all alone in the cold reading a letter. What did that matter to him? Dear Calvin, my name is Dorothy Jones, and I live in Beckham, Massachusetts, with my parents and 2 younger brothers. I'm 19 years old, and I enjoy cooking. I will clean, but it's certainly not my favorite thing to do. I like the idea of going west and finding adventure. As a woman, the only way I can really do that without a traveling companion is as a mail-order bride, so I will marry you. Let me know if you will accept me. I'm blonde with green eyes. Yours, Dorothy. Calvin read the letter once more and shrugged. She didn't seem all that excited to be a bride, but he didn't know if he'd be excited in her shoes either. 19 was awfully young, but hopefully she would be old enough to know what she was doing. He climbed down from his wagon and walked to the train station to buy her a ticket. He went back into the mercantile where the post office was and quickly scrawled out a note for Dorothy. Dear Dorothy, you sound like the perfect bride for me. I'm sending you a train ticket for the 1st of December. I hope you'll join me here. Yours, Calvin. There. That should do it. He handed the letter, along with a few dollars, the train ticket, and a bank draft for Miss Miller, back to the owner of the mercantile. He climbed onto the front seat of the wagon and drove back to his ranch. As he drove, he daydreamed about his beautiful bride and how they'd take one look at each other and just know they were meant to be together. He laughed at himself. He wasn't a romantic by nature, so he wasn't sure where these thoughts were coming from. Maybe he'd be a good husband after all. He'd certainly try. Whatever his sweet Dorothy wanted or needed, he would do his very best to provide for her. He wanted her to be happy in Missouri. Asterisk. Eliza felt like she was being stifled as the train pulled into yet another city. She'd spent the entire 4-hour ride watching a young mother juggle her 3 small children, and her heart ached for her sister's children and for the children she'd never have. How could she have children when her manager wouldn't even let her court someone? The last man who'd shown interest in her had been threatened and forced to leave her alone. She was due to sing the following evening, and her manager was not letting her out of his sight for fear she'd catch a cold and ruin her voice. She'd been an opera singer since she turned 16, and at 32, she wanted nothing more than to run away from the life she led. She enjoyed the hours singing on stage, but she hated the way people treated her as if she were a loose woman because she'd spent time entertaining others. She hated that she was always lonely but never alone. A new life beckoned to her, but she had no idea how to reach out and grab it. She wasn't certain why she was so restless, but she had to get away from Sebastian. He was making her absolutely crazy. He'd been half-father to her since her own father had died, and she'd needed to help support her family at 16. Her mother had died soon after, leaving her and her older sister, Beulah, who married a few months later. Her sister was now a widow with 2 boys, and it was her job to send money back home to help her sister out. She'd been raised in a small town in upstate New York and sang in church every Sunday. When a traveling salesman had heard her sing on his way through, he'd called Sebastian, and she'd been traveling with him and singing ever since. At first, Sebastian had been more of a father figure to her than anything else, but as time had gone by, he'd turned into something else. It was as if he felt that he owned Eliza, and she wasn't willing to even think about that. Langelina might have been created by him, but Eliza was her own woman. As soon as the train came to a complete stop, she leaned over and averted her eyes. "I need to go to the ladies' waiting room." She gave no other explanation as she hurried off the train toward the room she knew was waiting for her. She all but ran as she moved through the people, needing to be away as soon as she could. As she moved through the thick crowd, she felt something pressed into her hand. She looked down and saw her stage name, Langelina, scrawled on a piece of folded paper. She clutched it in her fist and kept moving, hurrying to get away. Hopefully the room would be quiet and she would have a moment to just sit and think. Why did she never have time to just sit and think? Even in her hotel room, she always felt as if she needed to be ready to rush out at any moment to be with her manager. She reached the quiet room and heaved a sigh of relief, walking to one of the low-upholstered benches along the side of the room. She sank onto one of the seats and unfolded the paper. Something fluttered to the floor, but she ignored it, reading the missive rapidly. "If you love your family, you will stop singing. Show this to no one." Eliza sucked in a breath, wondering what she could do. Maybe they didn't know her family and were making idle threats. She didn't know, but she wasn't certain she could take the risk. Looking down, she picked up the paper that had fluttered to the floor as she'd opened the note. It was her sister's name, city, and the names of her nephews. She knew then she had to get away. She didn't know how, but she had no choice. Looking around the small room, she tried to find a way out. Sebastian would be waiting for her outside the door of the waiting room. She couldn't go that way. 2 women walked in, one of them pulling the other by the hand. The pretty blonde, who was doing the pulling, turned to the short brunette. "What do you mean you're backing out now? He's expecting you to be there in 2 days." She didn't sound angry, but she did sound exasperated to Eliza. The shorter woman had tears in her eyes. "I really thought I could go through with it, but I just can't. What if he's a killer? What if he smells bad? I can't marry a total stranger. I don't know why I thought I could." She looked young, still a teenager, and Eliza couldn't help but wonder what the girl had agreed to. The blonde shook her head. "It's my responsibility to see that he gets a bride. What am I supposed to do now? Go in your place?" The irritation on the woman's face made Eliza grin. Eliza took a step forward without thinking. "Maybe I could be of assistance. My name is Eliza Woods. I need somewhere to go. Would he accept me for a bride?" Her real name felt strange on her lips. She'd been Langelina for so long, her other name seemed to have disappeared. Only her sister still called her Eliza, and she rarely got a chance to see her. The blonde turned to Eliza and looked her over as if she were taking her measure. "I'm Elizabeth Miller. I am a matchmaker who matches up mail-order brides with lonely men in the West. I would be a good mail-order bride." Eliza held her breath as she waited for the verdict. She knew she wasn't a tiny, slim woman like the girl who was supposed to be a bride. She was older by a decade, and was more than a little plump, but she hadn't been bothered by her size in years. Opera singers were expected to be large women. Elizabeth frowned. Do you have family you would need to inform? Eliza shook her head. The only thing she had with her was a drawstring purse attached to her wrist. She didn't carry much money, but she had enough to buy some fabric to make new clothes with. Nothing that she owned was suitable for a quiet life anyway, except for a few day dresses. She wouldn't be able to get them from Sebastian. No. I have a sister in New York, but she isn't expecting to see me anytime soon. I'll write her and let her know I'm fine. Elizabeth bit her lip, obviously contemplating the situation. Well, you know you'd be in the middle of Missouri, married to a rancher, right? Eliza nodded. She hadn't known, but she could deal with that. As long as she could get away from Sebastian and keep her family safe, she didn't care what she had to do. She loved to sing, but traveling to one city after another for years on end was taking its toll on her. She needed to settle down and have the family she'd always dreamed of. That's fine. She felt her heart beating rapidly in her chest as she waited for the other woman's verdict. Would she accept what she'd been told and let her go to marry the man? Elizabeth nodded to the woman beside her. Go on back to your family, Dorothy. She turned back to Eliza. Tell me a bit about yourself. Eliza took a deep breath, wondering exactly what she should say to convince the other woman she should be the one to go. Well, I grew up in upstate New York. My father died when I was 16, and my mother died soon after. My only sister married within a few months, so I was alone. She didn't want to tell the other woman about her career as an opera singer. So many people thought that women who were on the stage had loose morals, and Eliza refused to live with that stereotype for the rest of her life. She was determined to be plain Eliza Woods. Elizabeth nodded, obviously perplexed. How old are you now? I'm 32. Eliza prayed fervently that the other woman wouldn't ask what she'd been doing for the past 16 years. Have you ever been married? Do you have any children? Eliza shook her head. No. I've been alone for the past 16 years. It was only a partial lie. She'd felt alone, even though she'd never had a chance to be. Elizabeth had a questioning look on her face, but she didn't press the issue. Well, if you think you can do the job, then you're welcome to it. She held out a train ticket and some money. You'll be meeting Calvin Simpson in Missouri. He should be waiting for you, or rather Dorothy, at the train station. Explain to him why you're there, and that you're not the bride he was expecting. Hopefully he won't be angry with the switch. Eliza felt relieved. She wasn't certain how to get to the train without Sebastian seeing her, though. There's a man outside the door who thinks he owns me. Can you distract him while I sneak onto the train? She prayed the other woman wouldn't ask questions, and would simply accept her request. Elizabeth nodded slowly. Don't let any man mistreat you. I can't let you go unless you agree to come back to me if your husband is bad to you. Eliza nodded slowly. She wouldn't stay with a man who mistreated her, of course, but she also knew she'd never come back to this place where her sister and nephews had been threatened. I won't stay with a man who treats me badly, she said honestly, eliminating the fact that she'd never come back to Beckham, Massachusetts. What does the man look like? Elizabeth asked. He's tall with dark hair, blue eyes, and a mustache. Eliza didn't want to have to deal with Sebastian ever again. Elizabeth paid close attention to the time by consulting her watch, which had been pinned to the bodice of her dress. When it was time, she looked at Eliza. Are you ready? She asked, her voice serious. Eliza took a deep breath. She would have to hurry to make it work, but she knew she could do it. Sebastian became more possessive of her every day, and she couldn't imagine what he'd be like in another year. Add to that the danger her family was in, and she had to get away. Immediately. When you hear yelling, it's time to run for the train. Elizabeth opened the door as little as possible, squeezing through it sideways. Eliza closed her eyes, praying silently that she would be able to have the courage to do what needed to be done. She'd never been bold, but she would be now. She had to be. From outside, she heard Sebastian's loud voice. "Watch where you're going." Elizabeth's voice carried back to her. "Stop touching me." "Did you take my ticket?" "Where's my train ticket?" Eliza smiled in admiration. She was certain to draw a crowd. Pausing for a few seconds, she opened the door and looked around her. Elizabeth was in Sebastian's face, yelling at the top of her lungs about him stealing her train ticket. Eliza took her chance. Her bag was sitting at her manager's feet. She quickly grabbed it while no one was looking and ran for the train. Her clothes may not be terribly appropriate, but some of her day dresses would have to work until she could make more. She hurried onto the train and gave her ticket to the conductor, moving through the crowded conveyance to a seat about halfway back. She looked out the window and could see that Elizabeth was still yelling at Sebastian, who was red in the face. Eliza leaned forward and rested her elbows on her knees. Tears began to well in her eyes. Never in her life had she been as relieved as she was at that moment. She had no idea what Calvin would be like, but he couldn't be as bad as living on the road all the time, could he? Calvin stepped onto the platform of the train station in Puteville, Missouri. He was sweating, despite the cold due to his anticipation. His bride was about to step off the train. He would be married in a matter of hours. A wife. He'd never thought it would happen. Being alone was the worst part of owning a ranch, but a wife should solve everything for him. Life would be perfect once he had a wife to cook and clean and take care of him. He watched carefully as the train pulled into the station. Only one person got off, and it was a woman traveling alone. The woman was blonde, as the letter said she would be, but she looked older than the 19 years she had claimed to be. Not that her age bothered him. He had thought a 19-year-old would be too young for him anyway. He watched for a moment, wondering if anyone else would approach her, or if she was indeed his bride. After a few minutes, he walked toward her. "I'm Calvin Simpson," he said, his voice calm even though his hands were shaking. Eliza looked at the simple man before her. He was obviously a man who worked hard, and he kept his cowboy hat low over his eyes. "Eliza Woods." She held her hand out to shake his, but he stopped short, his hand a few inches from hers. "I'm looking for Dorothy Jones." He looked around and saw that the train was pulling out of the station. "Do you know if there was another woman traveling alone on the train? Did his bride decide not to come?" Eliza shook her head slowly. "There wasn't." She looked around for a place to sit with him for a moment to talk and spotted a bench. "Come sit with me, and I'll explain." Calvin frowned at her, but followed her to the bench and sat beside her, giving her his full attention. Now that the train had pulled out of the station, the sleepy little town was returning to normal. "What can I do for you, Miss Woods?" Eliza briefly explained what she'd seen in the waiting room in Beckham, ending with, "So I decided to take her place. I hope you don't mind." She wasn't certain if she wanted him to say she was the woman he'd waited for all his life, or if she wanted him to reject her. Could she go through with a marriage to a stranger? What would she do if she didn't? Calvin was confused for a moment as he looked at her. "You mean, you just took her ticket and came in her place? Is that allowed? Why would the mail-order bride agency agree to just slip another woman in his bride's place?" No, he had only exchanged one letter with Dorothy, but it still didn't seem right to him to get someone he hadn't sent for. "Well, the woman who was trying to convince her she'd committed to you said it was all right." Eliza looked down at her hands, realizing for the first time that she had agreed to marry a stranger who had never agreed to marry her. What was she thinking? "I don't think this is such a good idea," she mumbled, getting to her feet. She picked up her bag and turned to walk away, determined to put this awkward situation behind her. She'd figure something out. Calvin reached out and caught her wrist in his hand. "Where are you going?" he asked, still contemplating what she'd told him. "Didn't you come out here to marry me?" Eliza was tired. She'd spent 3 days on a train coming to meet this man, and he seemed not to care one way or the other. What was his game? "I did come here to marry you, but you obviously want the girl who agreed to marry you, not me." She tried to pull her hand away, but he held her tight. She refused to cause a scene. She couldn't draw attention to herself, so she stood staring down at his hand on her wrist, waiting for him to release her. "No, I don't even know the girl. I'm surprised, that's all." He looked her up and down. She was rounder than he'd expected, but in a way that was pleasing to the eye. Her hair was a golden blonde, pulled up into a bun atop her head. He could envision her with hair down around her bare shoulders, leaning over him. Forcing the image from his mind, he slid his hand along her wrist until he was gripping her hand. Eliza gave him the stare she'd used on countless other men who'd tried to strong-arm her over the years. Because of her talent as a mezzo-soprano, she'd been coveted by more men than she could count and had learned quickly to freeze them with a stare. "Let go of my hand, please." She kept her voice soft and sweet, not letting him see how truly angry she was. Calvin refused to be intimidated by her stare. "You used the train ticket I sent to come out here. Marry me." She couldn't walk away from him now, could she? There was something about her that made him able to think of nothing but holding her close. She stared at him in shock. How could he ask her that after the way he'd treated her? She found she liked him less and less by the moment. "No, thank you. I'll be on my way." Calvin sighed, realizing he'd made her angry. "Sit down with me for a moment and talk." Eliza wanted to run away, but she realized that she at least owed him a conversation, so she sat down beside him, dropped her bag at her feet, and made certain that her skirt didn't touch him at all. "What do you want to talk about, Mr. Simpson?" Calvin kept her hand in his, squeezing it slightly. "You agreed to marry me for a reason. Has that reason disappeared since you came here?" Why was she being so touchy? She shook her head. "No, it hasn't, but you obviously want the woman who you sent for, not me." She'd never been rejected before, but she'd also never been with a man as an equal. Most men heard her sing and immediately put her on a pedestal, not seeing her as anything more than a loose woman with a voice. "I was surprised." "If you sent off for something specific, and something else came in its place, wouldn't you be surprised?" he asked. "I'm not a thing, Mr. Simpson. I'm a woman." His eyes traveled down to where her breasts were pressed against the front of her gown. Her curves were beautiful to him, and he couldn't wait to take her in his arms. "You are indeed a woman." Eliza saw where his eyes were focused and her mouth dropped open in surprise. "I beg your pardon." Why would he think it was all right to look at her there? She'd grown used to men thinking she was a tart because she appeared on stage, but he knew nothing about her career. Calvin grinned sheepishly at her look. "I'm sorry. Well, you came here to be my wife. So, I didn't think you'd mind." "Of course, I mind. Even if I were planning to be your wife, I wouldn't allow you to stare at me as you have been. You should respect me." She looked at her dress, wondering what he found enticing about it. He used his free hand to stroke her cheek gently. "I do respect you. I'm sorry I was looking at you that way." He paused, struggling to find the right words. Now that she was beside him, he wasn't about to let her go. He'd come to town today to pick up his bride and take her to the preacher, and that was just what he planned to do. "Tell me why you agreed to be my bride." Eliza found she was reluctant to admit to her career on the stage, worried he'd think her a loose woman, as most men she'd met over the years had. Yes, she'd been kissed countless times by many men over the course of her career, but not once had she been kissed by a man she'd felt romantically inclined toward. I was at loose ends, trying to decide what I wanted to do with my life when I heard Elizabeth arguing with Dorothy. I decided that I wanted to take her place, because marrying sounded like the right answer. I have since changed my mind. I want you to stay and be my wife. Calvin smiled at her and brushed a stray tendril of hair from her face. It was chilly out in the cold December air, but he wanted her to stay. What do I have to say to get you to change your mind back? He asked. Why do you want me for your wife, Mr. Simpson? What is it about me that appeals to you? She knew her question was blunt to the point of rudeness, but at that moment she didn't care. She wanted him to realize that she wasn't the bride he wanted, and she knew she could lead him to that conclusion. I like you. I like your spirit. You're a beautiful woman, Eliza, and I can think of nothing I'd like more than to take you home with me as my bride. Eliza was surprised that he had an answer. She hadn't expected him to actually have any reasons he wanted to marry her. But you were disappointed that I wasn't Dorothy. Disappointment and surprise are two different things. I honestly thought that marrying a 19-year-old at my age was silly, but she was the only one who responded. I much prefer you to the vision I had in my head of her. Please, give me a chance. Eliza bit her lip. She'd agreed to marry him, but she wasn't certain it was the right thing to do at that moment. Is there a boarding house in town? Where I could stay while I think about it, she asked. He nodded and got to his feet. There is. I'll take you there, but I won't like it. She smiled at the petulant sound of his voice. And why won't you like it? Because I wanted to take my bride home with me today. He kept her hand in his as he picked up her carpet bag and walked down the street with her. May I see you tomorrow? His mind raced as he thought about how hard it would be to get away from the ranch for another full day. His foreman was a good one, but the work still needed to be done, and if he wasn't there to oversee it, the men didn't work as hard. It was that simple. Eliza considered his question for a moment. I'd like that. She envisioned him coming into town and taking her out to dinner and maybe even catching a play with her. Looking around the town, she knew the possibility of there being any kind of entertainment was slim, but that could work in her favor if she decided not to marry him. Of course, the longer she was in town, the greater the chance someone would spot her and let Sebastian know where she was. Did she really want to stay in town overnight? Did she want to even think about working somewhere in town and literally singing for her supper? She had her answer as soon as the thought crossed her mind. She stopped short and turned to the man beside her. He was nice to look at with dark hair and big brown eyes. She could marry him. I've changed my mind, because you so graciously agreed to me staying here. Let's marry now. She couldn't let her sister and her children be in danger because she didn't want to marry the man she had already agreed to marry. No, she'd marry him now and head to his ranch, wherever it may be. Maybe she hadn't been trained to be a good wife, but she knew she could do it. Calvin let out a whoop and picked her up, spinning her in a quick circle. Let's go see the preacher. Eliza blushed but nodded. I'd like that. Chapter 2. Calvin wanted to run with her the whole way to the pastor's house, but he forced himself to walk calmly and sedately. The pastor lives just 2 blocks over. Do you mind walking? We can take the wagon, but it seems silly for such a short distance. He enjoyed walking, and he liked the idea of spending a bit more time with her so she could get used to him before he kissed her for the first time. He imagined a first kiss was something that would make a woman nervous. Eliza shook her head. I'm fine with walking. She liked to be outdoors, and she especially enjoyed moving around. Sebastian had been beside her every step she took for so long. She felt very free all of a sudden. She loved the idea of running through a field of flowers, but realistically, she knew she wasn't much of a runner at her size. He wrapped his arm around her shoulders as they walked, doing his best to pay attention to where he was going instead of staring at her. Never had he felt he had the right to touch a girl the way he was touching her at that moment, and the thought of their wedding night kept rushing through his mind. He couldn't wait to have her naked in his bed. "You'll like Pastor Gibbons. He's in his mid-20s, with no children yet. He and his wife just married a year ago. He sounds nice." Eliza hoped it wouldn't take her a full year to have children. She wanted a dozen, and she was already 32, so she didn't have all that much time when it came right down to it. She had been a churchgoer her entire life, much to Sebastian's chagrin. He'd wanted her to avoid crowds of people, and she had when she wasn't performing, all except on Sunday mornings. She'd put her foot down about attending church. He's not one of those preachers who is trying to scare you half to death, either. I've never once heard him preach a fire and brimstone sermon. He's more likely to talk about how we're all sinners, and God's love is the only thing that can save us. He sounds like someone I'll really like. Eliza smiled. She'd heard many pastors over the years, but she preferred not to listen to the hell and damnation talks. The sermons that were focused on the good in everyone were her favorites. They walked along in companionable silence until he stopped in front of a small house. "He's expecting us." Not knowing what would happen when Eliza arrived, he hadn't planned a big wedding celebration for them, and he was glad of that now. What would have happened if they'd had a sign congratulating Calvin and Dorothy? He was marrying Eliza. He couldn't imagine that even under the circumstances any woman would be pleased. He knocked briefly on the door and waited, his heart pounding so hard in his chest he was surprised she couldn't hear it. Finally the door opened, and it was Mrs. Gibbons, the pastor's pretty young wife. She had auburn hair and brown eyes, and she always had a ready smile. "It's good to see you, Calvin. Is this your bride? Dorothy, isn't it?" Mrs. Gibbons had a gift for remembering details, she was told. Calvin wished she was a bit less gifted at that moment. Eliza blushed. "I'm his bride, but I'm not Dorothy. I'm Eliza." She held her hand out for the younger woman to shake. "Dorothy backed out at the last minute, and I took her place." She knew that people would be asking questions, so it would be easier just to get the correct story out to begin with. Mrs. Gibbons looked between the two of them with surprise, before opening the door wider to allow them entrance. "It's good to meet you, Eliza. I'll go get Mark." She hurried from the room as soon as they were inside, going to get her husband. Eliza hoped there wouldn't be many more uncomfortable questions about her marrying Calvin instead of the girl who was supposed to. She stood silently beside him waiting for the couple to return. A minute or two passed before Mrs. Gibbons came back into the room with a young man at her side. Eliza had never seen such a young minister. "So I hear you're Eliza, not the Dorothy we were expecting?" He grinned as he asked the question, putting Eliza at ease. He obviously wasn't one to criticize for a mix-up. "That's right. Although if it's too confusing for everyone, I suppose I can learn to answer to Dorothy." The pastor laughed softly. "I'm sure that won't be necessary. I think we can all adjust to calling you Eliza." He shook her hand briefly before looking at Calvin. "Are you ready?" Calvin nodded eagerly, taking Eliza's hand in his when instructed to by the minister. The ceremony was short and to the point, both of them repeating their vows in strong voices. When Pastor Gibbons pronounced them man and wife, Eliza was startled for a moment. She'd never even kissed this man. Of course, she'd been kissed countless times, but it had always been on stage or as part of a rehearsal. Never had she been kissed by a man who just wanted to kiss her because she was Eliza. She lifted her lips to his and closed her eyes, slightly embarrassed that her first real kiss was in front of people, but it was the life she'd chosen by agreeing to be a mail-order bride. She supposed she could have pulled him into an alley to kiss him for the first time. As the thought crossed her mind, she had to fight to stifle a giggle. She could just imagine her new husband's face if she'd done something so bold. Calvin brushed his lips gently across hers before raising his head and turning back to the pastor. "Thank you for taking the time out of your day to marry us, Pastor. It was my pleasure. I'll be seeing you on Sunday, right?" Calvin nodded. "We'll be there." He wasn't quite certain what to say to Eliza as they left the pastor's house, so he took her hand and led her through the quiet streets back to his wagon. Eliza felt unsure of herself as they walked, wondering what she was supposed to say to a man she barely knew who just happened to be her husband. "Tell me about your ranch." Calvin looked relieved to have something to talk to her about as he stowed her bag in the back of his wagon and handed her up to the seat. "It's only about 6 miles out of town, so we won't have to drive more than 30 minutes or so to come back to town when we need to." He walked around and climbed up beside her, picking up the reins in both hands. "I have a 40-acre spread, with mainly cattle, but I do have a few pigs, chickens, and cows. I like having the extra food they bring us." Eliza nodded, wondering if milking would be her job. When she'd been a child, it had been up to her to milk the cows and make certain they were fed. "Do you do all the work yourself?" He shook his head. "I have 5 men who work for me. They live in a bunkhouse on the property." She looked at him in surprise. "Do I need to cook for them all?" She hoped not. Learning to cook as a child and teenager had been as much a part of her life as any girl's, but she hadn't touched a stove in 16 years. She hoped he had some cookbooks and that it would all come back to her easily. "Oh, of course not. They do for themselves at mealtime." Eliza was extremely relieved. It was going to be hard enough for her to remember how to cook for her husband, let alone to learn to cook for a big crowd of men. Hopefully by the time children came along, she'd have mastered the skill. He drove along the dirt road out of town. She looked around her in surprise, learning the landscape. She'd been all up and down the east coast of the United States, but she'd never been given the opportunity to travel anywhere west before. Of course, Missouri wasn't really the West, but it was close enough that she considered it an adventure. "Do you do the outdoor chores, or will I be milking the cows and gathering eggs?" She knew how to do farm chores, because she'd been raised to do them, but it had been so long, she knew she was going to need help with most things. Should she tell him that now, or wait until later, though? "I'll do the outside chores. If you want a kitchen garden come spring, it'll be up to you to plant it." That sounds reasonable. It would also give her time to get a better handle on what she'd need to fix the meals she'd be cooking. "Do you have everything stocked up that I'll need for baking and cooking?" "Yes, you should be well stocked. If not, let me know, and we'll take a trip into town. You can make me a list, or I can go on my own." Eliza nodded. She'd rather send him on his own and avoid the chance of being recognized, but she knew she'd want to pick out her own fabric for dresses. "I'll go with you, I'm certain. I'd like to be able to make some new dresses for myself." She would just have to do her best to keep out of people's way. He shrugged. "You're welcome to do that." Taking her hand in his, he pulled off onto a dirt path in the road. There were 2 ruts on either side of a patch of grass that had obviously been the path where wagon wheels had traveled. Eliza watched her surroundings more carefully as they drove off the main road. "Is all this land yours?" He nodded. "I have land as far as the eye can see in front of us and to your right. The drive is shared by William Hampton. He's my closest friend and neighbor." "Is he married?" she asked. She liked the idea of having a close female neighbor she could spend time with. "No, he's not. If I turned the other way from the main road, we'd have got to Stanley Bond's house. The closest woman around is his wife, Abigail. I think she's 18. I know she's young and carrying her first child." Eliza couldn't imagine marrying so young, but she knew most women did. Her older sister had married at 18 and had been extremely happy until her husband died 5 years before. Her boys were 12 and 10, and Eliza loved to see them. "I look forward to meeting her." Calvin smiled, glad that Eliza was looking for ways to fit in and make friends already. "I'll be sure to introduce you at church on Sunday morning." He turned a corner and she saw a house set amongst the trees. It wasn't a huge house, but it was certainly big enough for the two of them and a couple of children. She wondered if it would have any of the luxuries she'd grown used to having over the years. She had grown up hauling water for her own baths, but the hotels she'd stayed in since she was 16 usually had running water. Living a rural life again was going to be hard to get used to. She could do it, of course, but she might not like it. When he stopped the wagon, she waited for him to come around and help her down, but instead, he went to the back of the wagon and retrieved her bag, looking at her expectantly. "Aren't you coming?" Eliza bit back a sharp retort. Didn't he even realize it was his job to help her down? Did the man have no manners? Why had he helped her in town, but not now? She carefully caught her skirt in one hand and climbed down from the wagon on her own, something she hadn't done since she was a girl. Men had fought over helping her down from wagons, and now she was married to a man who felt she should do for herself. She was realizing more and more just how much her life had changed by agreeing to marry a rancher. Once she was beside him, he led her to the house, and she was astonished to see that it was unlocked. She remembered keeping her doors unlocked as a child, but she'd had to lock them for so long now that she barely remembered any other way. Inside the house was a small entryway that led in two directions. One led to a small parlor and the other to a large kitchen with a table taking up most of the place. She looked at the stove and realized it was similar to the one she'd learned to cook on back in New York. That pleased her, because she was already nervous enough about cooking after so long away from it. "I'm going to put your bag on the bed," he told her, walking out of the kitchen. She followed him, wanting to see more of the house. The bedroom was up a short flight of stairs and to the right at the top. There was no bathroom in the house as she'd expected, but she felt oddly let down anyway. She really needed a good soaking after 3 days on a train, but she wasn't certain she'd have time for anything quite so frivolous that day. The bed took up most of the room, and she couldn't take her eyes off of it. Would she really be expected to share it with him that night? To let him have that kind of power over her body? She wasn't certain she could. "Go ahead and put your things away," he told her, breaking into her thoughts. "I cleared out the top 2 drawers in the chest of drawers for you, so you could have your own space." He walked around the bed to her and pulled her against him, his hands roaming over her back and down to her bottom. "I like to eat supper at 5. Make sure it's ready." With that, he abruptly released her and left the room. Eliza stood with her heart pounding in her chest as she watched him go. Had he really just touched her that way and then left? How odd. Knowing she would need time to prepare the evening meal, she rushed downstairs to the kitchen. She was surprised by just how clean everything was. She'd really expected to find a mess waiting for her, but even the stove looked as if it had just been scrubbed. She looked on the shelves and saw very little food, finally opening a door against one wall. It was a pantry, and had many of the things she'd need to cook for him. There was lard, sugar, flour, and many other staples. She was relieved to see just how well stocked it was. She pulled up the ring on the cellar door and descended the stairs, finding a well-stocked cellar as well. There were dried meats as well as fresh. It was cold enough that the fresh meat seemed to be keeping well. She found a small pork roast that she took upstairs to cook, along with some potatoes and carrots. She knew she could handle something that simple. She worried a bit about whether she'd be able to bake bread on her own. She found a small stack of recipes on the shelf in the pantry and realized that he'd been cooking for himself. There were food stains on the pages of the papers, but she didn't care at all. She'd be able to do her duty as a wife and keep him fed. That was all that mattered to her at that moment. She put the roast into a pot and covered it with water before peeling and cutting up the potatoes and adding them. She peeled and sliced the carrots, putting them into the water and then placing them all in the oven. It was only after she'd opened it that she realized she hadn't yet started the fire. She shook her head. She was going to have to learn to be a good cook. Her new husband deserved to have edible food for dinner every night. After starting the fire, she mixed up dough for bread, hoping she would have time for it to rise and cook before Calvin came in for dinner. Where he'd spend his day, she didn't know. She made a mental note to ask him about what he did every day so she would have something to talk to him about. Asterisk. When Calvin got home at the end of his day, he went to the barn as usual to milk the cows. He didn't know what Eliza was cooking, but he was relatively certain he'd drink milk with whatever it was. He always drank milk with his meals. When he entered the house, he was shocked by the scene in front of him. There were the glorious scents of baking bread filling the air, and the table was set, but there was flour everywhere. Eliza was covered in it from her forehead to the tips of her black shoes, which peeked out from beneath her dress. The floor was caked in it as well as the work table. It looked as if she'd opened a bag of flour and just scattered it willy-nilly around the room. He stopped short, the pail of milk dangling from one hand. "What happened?" he asked. Eliza looked up with a blank look, not realizing what he was asking. The bread smelled good. Dinner was on the table. What could be wrong? "I made dinner," she told him, her voice filled with obvious pride. "I can see that." He walked to her, set the milk pail on the work table, and brushed some flour from her forehead with his thumb. "Did you roll in the flour?" The confusion on his face was apparent. She looked down at the front of her and realized she was covered in flour. She blushed slightly as she became aware that she hadn't even thought to don an apron before she began her chores. She didn't even have an apron to put on. She'd have to work on that first thing in the morning. The one skill she'd kept up over the years had been her sewing, because she was constantly making herself new costumes or new clothes. Sebastian hadn't been willing for her to wear anything but her stage clothes, so she'd had to make day clothes for herself. "I guess I forgot to wear an apron." He shook his head with a slight laugh. "I guess you did." Of course, an apron wouldn't have begun to take care of the mess she made, but he was too polite to point that out to her. "I also forgot to bring an apron," she admitted in a soft voice, wondering what on earth he'd think of her. "Well, you'll just have to make one then, won't you?" He couldn't see her ruining all her dresses by making such a huge mess when she cooked. How could someone make a mess that big when they cooked? He'd honestly never seen anything like it. Eliza looked around at the flour all over the kitchen floor. "Maybe I should make one for the kitchen as well," she suggested. He grinned. "Maybe you should." Leaning down, he kissed a part of her cheek that had been missed in the great flour explosion before sitting down at the table. "Pork roast?" he asked. "One of my favorites." She smiled, rushing to get the loaf of bread from the oven. "I couldn't find any butter. I was almost out, and didn't get any from the store the last time I was in town." "We have a churn." He looked at her, wondering for the first time if she was capable of being a good wife. Yes, she was pleasant to look at, and his body reacted very strongly to her presence, but did she know how to work? Despite what she'd done that day, he couldn't help but wonder. She hurried to the table and put the bread on it. "I'll make butter tomorrow then." She'd helped churn butter many times as a child. She knew she could make butter without a problem. With as cold as the cellar was, it would keep there for some time. "I found the cream in the cellar, so there should be more than enough to make butter." She sat down across from him and watched as he bowed his head. She was thankful to be with a man who prayed. Sebastian had always laughed at her for insisting they pray before every meal. It had seemed odd to her that he hadn't found it necessary, but she hadn't been able to talk him into changing his ways. She bowed her head and waited while he said a simple prayer. Eliza cut the bread and put a piece on each plate, wincing a little at how hard the crust was as she tried to slice through it. She put a piece of the roast on her plate and waited while he took some potatoes and carrots. He looked around. No gravy? He'd never had a pork roast without gravy before. I didn't have time to make it, she told him, which was the truth, but she also didn't know how. She'd look through the short stack of recipes he had and see if she could do it from something there. If not, she'd have to ask someone to help her learn to make gravy, but that would require an explanation of why she hadn't learned. Oh, she hoped there was a recipe. All right. Next time I'd like gravy with my potatoes. Eliza nodded, embarrassed that she hadn't done the right thing and hoping fervently she'd figure out how. She wasn't certain why she didn't want him to know that she was an opera singer, but she desperately wanted to keep that knowledge from him as long as possible. She knew it would come out eventually, of course, but the longer he was kept in the dark, the better to her way of thinking. While they ate, she asked him about his day, and he talked about mending fences. It's a never-ending job. In the spring, we're dealing with the calves, in the fall, we have roundup. Year-round, we're riding fences making certain that they're all in good repair so the cattle can't escape. Do the men ride around with you? He shrugged. I usually have one man out riding fences with me, and another team of 2 men will work on them as well. The other 3 men will make sure the cattle are all right, or work on different things around the ranch yard. None of us do the same things all day every day. The work is diverse. She smiled, liking that aspect of things. I'd like to go with you onto the range on occasion if I may. She wanted to understand him better, and seeing him work would help her do that. She couldn't be a good wife if she didn't know her husband, could she? He looked at her in surprise. She seemed much too feminine to work with him, and that was a fact. Maybe in the spring when the weather is nicer, and you've done what you want to do around the house. She looked around her, not certain what he was talking about. The house looked good to her. She needed to make a female friend quickly to come over and look at things and tell her what she needed to change to make things better. Maybe Abigail, the closest woman, would be able to come over and tell her what needed to be done. That sounds good. Wouldn't she need to be putting in her kitchen garden in the spring as well? She wished there was some sort of manual for how to survive on a ranch. She could read it when he wasn't looking and figure out exactly what she was supposed to be doing. After supper, while she did the dishes and swept up the flour from the floor, he sat at the table with a knife and a block of wood in his hand and sang while he whittled. When he sang the first note, Eliza was thrilled, because he had a clear, strong baritone voice. The second and third notes sent chills down her spine. He had a nice voice, but he couldn't carry a tune. He was just singing a folk song, but still, he should stay on tune. She hoped he didn't like to sing much, because she knew he would make her crazy if he did. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to find the inner strength to listen to him without yelling. Calvin smiled as he saw her eyes close. She was enjoying his singing. He'd hoped that would be the case. He'd have to sing more often. Chapter 3. After she'd finished with the dishes, Eliza escaped to their bedroom for a moment with a pitcher and a bowl to clean up. She wanted a full bath, but that would have to wait until he was on the range the following day. She wasn't nearly bold enough to bathe in front of her new husband. She undressed quickly and washed her face, arms, and chest, pulling a nightgown over her head. She wished she had something prettier than her plain white utilitarian nightgown, but she didn't, and she wasn't going to waste what little money she had left on something she'd sleep in. Once she was wearing her nightgown, she crawled between the sheets and pulled the covers clean up to her neck. She didn't want him to see her. What was she thinking? She was in bed waiting for her new husband to join her, and he had every right to do whatever he wanted to her body. She barely knew the man, and he was soon going to be touching her like that. Her sister had been kind enough to explain the ways of men and women to her, so she'd know what she needed to avoid if a man made advances. She knew what he would do. She also knew she wasn't ready for any man to do that to her. Could she tell him that she wanted to wait without making him hate her? By the time Calvin entered the room, Eliza had worked herself into a state of panic. Just the idea of him touching her arm made her want to run off screaming into the night. How would she be able to lie there and let him put his thing inside her? He turned out the light before undressing, seeing that his new wife was shy. He didn't want to shock her when he undressed, and he was already fully erect. She was too inexperienced for that. So was he when it came right down to it. All afternoon, since the moment he'd met her, he'd thought of nothing but the moment when he'd be able to sink inside her welcoming flesh. Yes, tonight was the night. He was going to make love to his wife and find out how it felt once and for all. He slipped between the sheets and reached out to her, pulling her against him. She was stiff and obviously very nervous. Hopefully he could make her forget her nervousness and enjoy what they'd do together. He moved his hand over the covers until he found her face and moved his thumb over her soft lips. He hadn't kissed her mouth since the wedding. He was afraid that once he started he wouldn't be able to stop. Slowly, he lowered his head toward hers and kissed her, his tongue coming out to trace her lips. She stayed stiff against him, wanting nothing more than to put her hands on his chest and push him away. She had to get out of the bed. She'd seen another bed down the hall that was all made up as if for company. Surely he'd understand if she told him she needed to sleep there for a while. "Calvin," she asked, turning her head from his kiss. His lips went to her neck, biting and suckling as he asked, "Yeah? I can't do this." She knew she was being blunt and should probably soften the blow, but she really didn't know how. She didn't want him touching her. How could she submit to him without knowing anything about him except that he sang off-key? Calvin lifted his head and looked down at her in the darkness. "Are you denying me?" She sighed, feeling the tears coming to her eyes. "I'm just not ready yet. I've only known you for a few hours." She sucked in a breath. "A month. Can you give me a month to get used to the idea of this?" Calvin rolled to his back, more than a little offended by her request. She'd come out there to be his bride, and now she wasn't willing to have intercourse with him? "A month? I'm not waiting a month. I've waited my entire life for tonight, and you're telling me that you don't want me to make love to my wife on our wedding night?" Eliza leaned onto her elbow beside him, trying to find a good way to explain what she was feeling. "I know it's a lot to ask, but I've never done this with a man before. I just don't know you well enough to let you do that to me yet. If you give me a month, I promise, I'll be ready." He frowned. He hated it, but he did see her point. They didn't really know one another, and she had the right to say she didn't want him touching her yet. He hated it though, because he'd already waited. Why did he have to wait even longer? "I'll give you a week." Eliza blinked, thrilled to have a week, but knowing she needed a bit more. 3 weeks. 2 weeks, and I get to kiss you and try to convince you to change your mind whenever I feel like it. He was certain he could convince her if he tried hard enough. Eliza thought over his words for a moment before finally nodding. 2 weeks. Calvin reached up and cupped the back of her neck, bringing her down to kiss him. His hands roamed over her body, moving all the way from her bottom to her shoulders. "I won't lie and say I like it, but I do understand. 2 weeks from tonight, we're making love. Put it on your calendar." She laughed softly. "I'll do that." She felt as if an enormous weight had been lifted off her shoulders as she moved to the edge of the bed and sat up. "Where are you going?" he asked. "I'm going to go sleep in the spare room down the hall." "I'm sure you don't want me in bed with you when I won't let you." She couldn't even finish her sentence. Calvin caught her hand and pulled her back against him. "You're staying. You promised I could keep trying to convince you to make love, and I can't convince you if you're down the hall." He pulled her flush against him, feeling her unbound breasts press against him through the thin cotton of her nightgown. He wondered if it was too soon for him to touch one, just through the fabric, but he didn't want to frighten her any more than she already was. Knowing that he wasn't going to try to force sex on her, Eliza responded to his touch, liking it. She leaned forward and kissed him. This time it was her tongue tracing his lips. She caught his bottom lip between her teeth and bit it gently, enjoying his fingers against her. Calvin sucked in a breath of surprise as he pulled her closer, his hand moving as if of its own volition to cup her breast in his palm. He deepened the kiss, his mouth opening for her tongue as his hand gently molded her soft breast. Eliza moaned deep in her throat, wishing there was no nightgown between them. She unbuttoned the 4 buttons at the front of her nightgown, and moved his hand inside it so he could touch her bare skin. He couldn't believe how bold she was in letting him touch her breast, but he wasn't one to look a gift horse in the mouth. He caught her nipple between his thumb and forefinger, immediately intrigued by how hard the small nub was. It was too dark to see the color, but in his mind it was a soft pink surrounded by a darker pink aureole. He couldn't wait to see if his imagination was correct. Her arms moved around him, and she stroked his bare back, finding a small mole just above his waistline. Never in her life had she touched the bare skin of a man before, but suddenly she wanted nothing more than to feel him all over. She felt a tingling between her thighs. Knowing it was time to stop, she pulled back from his kiss. "We should go to sleep," she murmured, brushing her lips against his one last time. Calvin wanted to scream in frustration, but he didn't. He pulled his hand from her nightgown and pressed his lips to her forehead. 2 weeks couldn't pass quickly enough. He was hard and aching, and he had to make love to her soon. He was truly blessed to have found such a passionate woman for his wife. Asterisk. Years of staying up late to work and sleeping until late morning had taken a toll on Eliza. When she felt Calvin get out of bed beside her, she pulled a pillow over her face, not wanting to wake up to the light he'd turned on. "It's time to get up, Eliza." His voice was soft and gravelly with sleep, but insistent. She wanted nothing more than to tell him to go away. "I hate mornings," she mumbled, her voice muffled by the pillow. He laughed, pulling the pillow from her face. "Wake up, sleepyhead. You need to cook breakfast while I milk the cows and gather eggs." She groaned, but knew he was right. This is what she'd agreed to do when she married him. It was her job to cook breakfast every morning. She sat up, rubbing her eyes, not realizing she'd forgotten to button her nightgown after their intimacy of the night before. "I'm up." Calvin's eyes latched onto her nipple, as pink as he'd imagined it would be. He wondered how she'd react if he caught it between his lips, but he knew he didn't have time. The sun was about to rise, and he needed to get to work. He couldn't resist reaching out, catching her nipple between his fingers, and giving it a quick tug to watch it harden. "I'll be back in 30. Eliza watched him leave the room, more than a little startled by his actions. She looked down and saw that her nightgown was spread wide, with one nipple exposed to the morning air, and she quickly covered it. Blushing, she got out of bed and dressed as fast as she could before hurrying down to the kitchen to start breakfast. She had the fire going in moments, and put a skillet on the stove to heat, while she climbed down the cellar stairs to get bacon and yesterday's eggs. By the time he returned from milking, she had a plate of scrambled eggs and bacon for each of them, as well as toast with no butter. She'd found some strawberry preserves in the cellar that she'd put on the table with a spoon. If he wanted them, he could add them to his dry toast. He leaned around her to put the milk pail on the work table, before grabbing her by the shoulders and kissing her thoroughly. She stood on tiptoe, pressing her body against his as she kissed him back. "Good morning," she whispered. Calvin took his spot at the table, no longer as disappointed by the delay in their lovemaking. She was a passionate woman, and he was certain he could convince her to make love well before the 2 weeks were up. She enjoyed kissing and touching far too much to hold out for that long. He was certain of it. Asterisk. After breakfast, Eliza dug through the recipes in the pantry and found nothing that would help her to learn to make gravy. She knew he liked it and desperately wanted to make it, but it wasn't going to be possible unless she got her hands on a cookbook. He'd told her he'd be home for lunch, so she knew she needed to get him to take her into town then. First, though, she needed to do the laundry, including her dress she'd worn the day before, which was covered in flour. She'd seen her mother do laundry, of course, but she'd never actually done it herself. She gathered the scrub board and took the clothes to the basin. She boiled water. She didn't know why, but she'd seen her mother do it, so she did as well. The first thing she picked up to wash was one of Calvin's shirts. It was a thick flannel shirt that he obviously wore through the winter months. She carefully moved it against the scrubbing board with all of her strength, pushing down on it to get it as clean as she could. She spent 10 minutes on that first shirt, and when she picked it up and looked at it, it was obvious that she had no idea what she was doing. She'd scrubbed 3 holes clean through the shirt. She looked and found another, and scrubbed it more gently this time, and the results seemed better. He only had his church shirt and 3 others, though, and she'd just destroyed one. She'd have to make him a new shirt. And how was she supposed to admit to her new husband that she'd put holes in his shirt? When she'd finished with the scrubbing, she carried the wash to the line and took the bag of clothespins that was hooked to it. She carefully looked at them, and through the process of trial and error, she was able to hang everything on the line. Going back into the house, she churned the butter before making him a quick lunch of bacon sandwiches. She again toasted the bread because it hid how hard the bread she'd made the previous day was. Calvin stepped into the house for lunch, and Eliza smiled at him brightly, blinking the tears away. She was a disaster as a wife, and she knew it. How was she going to keep him happy when she couldn't do anything right? "I made bacon sandwiches for lunch," she told him. He nodded, not much caring what she'd cooked. He was hungry, and he'd eat anything at that point. "Sounds good." He kissed her before taking a seat at the table and waiting for her to join him. After their prayer, he ate his 3 sandwiches quickly while she picked at hers. Finally, she told him about the shirt. "I've never actually washed clothes before, so I didn't know what to do. I feel so stupid." The tears filling her eyes told him that she wasn't kidding. "How can you be 32 and not know how to wash clothes?" he asked. "Did you always have a maid or something?" He'd never heard tell of a woman who didn't know how to do basic household chores, but he'd apparently married one. She nodded, not going into detail. "I need you to drive me to town for fabric and a cookbook. I need to make myself an apron and you a new shirt." She was covered with water from the washing. A good sturdy apron would be needed to save her clothes. He nodded. "We'll go this afternoon. I need to ride out and let my men know, but I'll take you." He thought briefly about letting her go to town with one of his ranch hands so he could stay there and work, but he didn't want his new bride to go off with another man the day after they married. He wasn't really a jealous man, but he was going to keep his wife close. When he returned from the range to drive her into town, she was waiting for him. She had made a short list of what she'd need. He hitched up the horses and helped her get into the wagon. "I have some beans soaking for supper," she told him, letting him know that she was focusing on what he would eat. "I'll be able to cook them up after we get back from town." He nodded briefly. "That's fine." He watched the road carefully as he drove toward town, excited to show his new bride off. There just weren't enough women in these parts, and a pretty one like Eliza was bound to turn heads. "I'm sorry about your shirt. I'm trying really hard to do everything right." She hated that he knew she'd ruined something of his. If she could have hidden it, she would have. "I know you are. I'm not angry about the shirt." He didn't ask more questions about her past, because she didn't seem to want to answer them. She seemed willing to talk about her childhood, but nothing about the adult years she'd spent since finishing school. She smiled at him, holding his arm to her. Thank you for not being upset with me. He kissed her cheek before turning back to the road. If there are things you don't know how to do, you can ask me. After you meet Abigail, I'm sure she'll help you. I know you were expecting a competent wife, she began, not sure how to continue. Not every woman is good at household chores. Obviously, they weren't important to you. He didn't look at her as he made the statement, hoping she would volunteer information about her past. My mother did her best to teach me everything I'd need to know, she said, not willing to say more. He waited for a further explanation, but when he didn't get it, he changed the subject. Were you an only child? No, I have a sister. She's 2 years older than me. I have 2 nephews who are 12 and 10. They still live in the town where I grew up in upstate New York. She hadn't seen her family in 2 years. She had last seen them for Christmas. She couldn't even begin to express how much she missed them. My sister's a widow, she added as an afterthought. I bet you're a fun auntie. She smiled. I try to be. I'm not very good with children, though. It was something she wanted to improve before she had a chance to have children of her own. You're not? He thought about that statement for a moment before asking a question that occurred to him. You want children, though, don't you? Yes, I really do. I think I'll be better with my own. I want at least a dozen. He stared at her in surprise before letting out a bark of laughter. A dozen? Is that all? She grinned. I don't want to be greedy. She was glad he took her words for what they were, which was a jest. She did want children and would gladly take as many as God gave her, but she'd be content with just 2 or 3 if that's all she was blessed with. He put his lips against her ear and whispered, I'll be happy to help you make them. She blushed furiously. You're not supposed to say that to me. Did he not understand anything about manners or propriety? You're my wife. I can talk about how much I like your body and how much I want you. His arm that was around her shoulders squeezed her tighter. He hadn't expected to enjoy being with his wife nearly as much as he did. She was fun to tease, though, and he was happy to know that he'd enjoy time with her both in and out of bed. When she didn't respond, he started to sing to her, a folk song that he really enjoyed singing. He didn't notice her cringe at his singing, and sang loudly and happily the whole way. Chapter 4. Eliza bought only the things she needed, and did her best to keep some of her face hidden by her bonnet so she wouldn't be recognized. She bought enough fabric for 3 aprons and 2 new flannel shirts for him. She also bought knitting needles and some yarn, planning to make him a scarf for Christmas. She had no idea what he really wanted or needed, and the holiday was only a few weeks away. As they were loading their supplies, Calvin waved to a young couple in a farm wagon. When they stopped, he introduced her. This is my wife, Eliza. Eliza, these are our neighbors, Abigail and Stanley Bond. Eliza smiled up at the other woman whose hand was resting on her swollen belly. She looked to be about midway through her pregnancy, to Eliza's uneducated eyes. Eliza hurried forward. It's so nice to meet you. Abigail smiled down at her shyly. I'm happy to have a woman close by finally. We don't have many around these parts. That's what I hear. Eliza wondered how to request what she needed. Why don't you come over tomorrow afternoon for tea? I'll make us an afternoon snack. She hadn't had time to just sit and talk to another woman for years. Her conversation with Elizabeth and Beckham was the longest she'd had in a long while. Abigail nodded, her face lighting up. I'd like that a lot. What time would you like me to come? Eliza thought about that for a moment. Let's say 2. Would that be all right? That would give her time to clean up after lunch and start dinner before the other woman arrived. She could also bake some kind of treat if she could find a recipe for one in her cookbook. I'll be there. Stanley raised his hand in farewell as he drove off down the street. Eliza turned to Calvin and smiled. I haven't had a female friend in so long, I barely remember what it's like. She was all but bouncing up and down in her excitement. Calvin couldn't help but wonder why she hadn't been around women, but he didn't ask. When she wanted him to know more about her past, she'd tell him. You'll really like Abigail. I've never met a sweeter woman. For a moment, Eliza wondered if he wished he'd been the one to marry the younger woman, but she realized that he probably just admired her. He didn't seem the type to stray from his wife, even in his thoughts. The whole drive home, Eliza thought about how she'd broach the subject of getting help with her chores from Abigail. She didn't really need the other woman to help her do them, of course, she just needed to be shown the correct way to do many of them. She was very excited to think about having a friend. When Eliza didn't talk on the way home, Calvin again sang to her, obviously enjoying the sound of his own voice. She couldn't believe he couldn't hear just how bad he was. Maybe after supper, she'd give him a treat and let him hear some real singing. She fixed cornbread to go with the beans, finding a recipe for it in her new cookbook. While she cooked, she thought about how she'd sing for him that evening. Maybe while she was sewing his shirt, she'd break into song and let him hear her. She knew he'd admire her songs. He loved to sing so much, how could he not? He ate the supper she fixed wholeheartedly, obviously enjoying her cooking. She felt more comfortable with the meal she'd fixed today than the one from yesterday. She'd spend some time with the cookbook, learning how to make gravy and everything else she could. She certainly wanted him to be able to eat his fill every night without worrying that her food was disgusting. He started singing while she was doing dishes, and she wanted to tell him to stop because he was hurting her ears. She didn't, though. When he finished his first song, she broke into an aria from Carmen called Habanera. Carmen was a relatively new opera, only 12 years old, so she was certain he wouldn't have heard it yet. She continued to wash the dishes as she sang, her vocal range shown off beautifully by the French song. When she finished, she stood waiting for his reaction, expecting him to do as many other men had done and tell her he loved her on the spot. Calvin waited a moment after she finished singing. That was right pretty, but I don't know whatever that language was. Do you know Yankee Doodle? That's one of my favorites. Eliza gaped at him in shock for a moment. Had he really just asked her, one of the most well-known mezzo-sopranos in the country, to sing Yankee Doodle? It took her a moment to find her voice. No, I don't believe I know that one. Here, I'll teach it to you. He broke into song once more. Somehow she didn't run from the house with her ears covered screaming into the night. It was close, but she managed to control herself. After the dishes, she sank into a chair and carefully took apart the shirt she'd ruined, knowing it would be the easiest way to get his size and make the shirt like the other had been. She didn't say anything as he continued to regale her with folk songs, making her wish she had something, anything, to wad up in her ears to block out the sound. Asterisk. When Abigail arrived the following afternoon, Eliza had tea and cookies made for the two of them to share. After they were seated, Eliza brought up the real reason she'd invited her over. I am really hopeless when it comes to some of the household chores. I was hoping you'd be willing to help me learn to do some things. I'm making a stew for dinner, and I have no idea how to thicken it. She'd scoured the cookbook, but she couldn't find anything that would teach her what she needed to do. Abigail smiled. Oh, I'd be happy to help you. She took a sip of her tea, reaching for a third cookie. I'm not always so greedy for sweets, but apparently the little one likes them. Eliza smiled, happy to know the younger woman was willing to talk a bit about her pregnancy. When are you due? She asked, eyeing the huge mound that was the other woman's stomach. Oh, not until March. I'm ready, though. Abigail patted her stomach lovingly. I'm really hoping for a boy. That would be nice. Is there a midwife in the area to help you? Abigail shrugged. Not really a midwife, but there's a woman who helps people have babies. She just hasn't had any formal training. Does that scare you? Eliza couldn't imagine having a baby without a doctor or midwife right beside her. Not really. She's delivered over 100 babies. I'm sure I'll do fine. Eliza nodded. She'd still be frightened, but she didn't want to say that. She quickly changed the subject so she wouldn't blurt anything out about it. Calvin seems to think I'm going to want to fix up the house somehow, but I can't see anything wrong with it. Do you know what he meant? Abigail gaped at her in surprise. I'm sure he meant things like curtains and a tablecloth. Your house would be so much prettier that way. Eliza looked around and noticed for the first time those things weren't there. Oh. I never thought of that. She'd been surrounded by fine things for so long, she honestly didn't realize they were missing. Traveling from one hotel to another had taught her to appreciate wherever she was for the good qualities, but not to dwell on what was lacking. I guess I'll need more fabric then, won't I? If you want help with them, I'm happy to come over. Eliza smiled at the offer. Why don't you teach me the few things I really need to do now, and then we'll maybe meet up every Wednesday for lunch so I can ask questions. She was thrilled the other woman was willing to go along with her plan to get help. Maybe she could hide how inept she was from Calvin for a while longer. Abigail nodded. I'd like that a lot. Calvin is such a nice man. I'm glad he found you. Asterisk. That evening after the dishes were finished, and she'd completed his shirt for him, she wrote a quick letter to her sister just to let her know that she was safe and all right. Instead of sending it directly to her sister, though, she wrote to her sister's mother-in-law and asked her to pass the message along. She didn't want to be found through her sister. Dear Beulah, I wanted to let you know that I've married and settled in Missouri. I don't want anyone to find me here, so please, have your mother-in-law send any correspondence for you. I've married a sweet man named Calvin Simpson, and I wish with all my heart that he either loved to sing a bit less, or he could hear when he misses every single note. He has a nice voice, but he can't carry a tune in an airtight bucket. He's a good man, though, and I'm happy to be his wife. I wish I was closer to you and the boys, but I have no real choice in the matter. Give Gavin and Jackson my love. Watch out for them and for yourself. There are bad people in this world. All my love, Eliza. When she finished the letter, she got it ready to mail. Who are you writing? Calvin asked as she set the letter on the table to be mailed. My sister, Beulah. She'll worry if she doesn't hear from me. Of course, the real reason she was writing is so she could make certain her sister was safe. She was the worrier, not the other way around. She wished she could be with her sister and make certain she was always safe. You said she's in upstate New York, right? He'd never been that far east, having been raised in Ohio. Yes, with her 2 boys. Eliza wasn't willing to give even him a lot of information about her family, because she was so worried something would happen to them. She needed them to be safe. He nodded, watching her carefully. There was something she wasn't telling him, but he had no idea what it was. She was a good wife to him, and at the moment that was all that mattered. Eliza stood and stretched. I'm going to get ready for bed, she told him. You do work on Saturdays, don't you? She'd never known anyone other than a teacher who took Saturdays off work, but she had to ask. Yup. Of course I do. I take Sundays off for the Sabbath, but that's the only time. Give me a few minutes to get ready. She left the room quickly, hurrying up the stairs. She was always worried he'd come into the room while she was washing up and putting her nightgown on. After cleaning up, she slipped between the sheets, already quivering with anticipation. Every night when he climbed into bed beside her, he'd kiss her and stroke her and do everything he could to make her feel like the most beautiful woman alive. Tonight would be no different, she was certain. Calvin walked slowly up the stairs to their bedroom, making certain to give her enough time to change, but knowing he was going to do things a bit differently that night. Every night so far, he'd turned down the lamp before getting undressed and going to bed. Tonight, he was going to leave the light on and look at her lovely body as he touched her. He knocked on the door and went in, moving to the water bowl. He pulled his shirt out of his pants without looking at her, but he knew she was watching him. He could feel her heated gaze on his skin. He removed his shirt, dropping it to the floor as he made use of the water in the bowl. When he unfastened his pants and dropped them, he heard her gasp, but he didn't look her way. Finally, he turned to walk over to the bed and found her staring at him, her eyes glued to his erection. He expected to see a bit of fear in them, but not his sweet Eliza. No, she was looking at him with appreciation. There was no doubt in his mind then that she wanted him just as much as he wanted her. He wasn't going to stop tonight unless she asked him to. He wanted to be inside her, and she knew him well enough now to know he wouldn't hurt her. He said a quick prayer that she wouldn't ask him to stop. Eliza was surprised that he hadn't turned off the light, but she enjoyed the view of his long, lean body, the glow from the lamp afforded her. She studied every inch of his bare skin, pleased to finally be able to look at him. She watched as he climbed into bed beside her, holding her breath as he moved to the middle of the bed, as always, and pulled her against him. He hadn't been overly appreciative of her voice, which had surprised her, but she knew what her man wanted. She got onto her knees on the bed, and pulled her nightgown over her head, tossing it to the floor. Being that bold went against her nature and everything inside her, but she didn't care. He had been good to her, hiding her from her fears and being gentle when she'd messed up. She would give him the gift he'd been waiting for a week and a half early. Calvin stared at her pink-tipped breasts, swallowing hard. He wanted to touch her. He needed to touch her. He got to his knees facing her, his hands reaching out to stroke down the sides of her breasts and over her slightly rounded stomach. "You're so beautiful." She smiled, her hand stroking his cheek. "I'm a little rounder than most men like." He shrugged. "I think you're perfect just the way you are." One hand stroked her breast, the thumb teasing her nipple. The other went straight down to her knee and gently moved up toward the juncture of her thighs. "I have to touch you." Eliza nodded, her hands going out to grip his shoulders. "Touch me anywhere." He took her at her word, his hand going up to her core, one finger gently toying with her nub. "Spread your legs for me a little, sweetheart," he mumbled, his lips going to the side of her neck to distract her from what his hand was doing between her legs. As soon as she moved her legs apart, his finger moved down, finding her center, and gliding gently inside. She was so tight around his finger, he almost groaned, wanting desperately to feel her gripping his manhood the same way she gripped his finger so tightly. Eliza let out a low moan as his finger slid inside her. She'd never even dared to touch herself there, and this man, whom she'd only known for a few days, had his finger inside her. Her lips found his and pressed hard, her tongue venturing out to trace his lips. Calvin slowly moved his finger in and out of her tight core, wanting nothing more than to end this torture. He needed her. Would she understand that? He broke the kiss, staring into her eyes as he added another finger to the first, still moving them both inside her. "I need you," he whispered. She nodded slightly, her hand moving down his body and gripping his manhood in her hand. "I need you, too." As soon as the words were out, she wanted to take them back, but she knew she couldn't. He needed to know that she was as aroused by their touching as he was. He removed his fingers from her body, surprised by how wet they were from her moisture. Moving backward, he pressed his back against the headboard of the bed and pulled her astride him, one of her thighs on either side of his. He carefully guided her down until the tip of his member was pressing inside her, just a bit. Eliza stared at him with wide eyes. She hadn't expected him to pull her down over him, and she wasn't certain exactly what he wanted her to do. I don't know how, she told him, wanting more of him inside her, filling the ache that spread through her entire body. The sweat stood out on his brow from the effort it was taking to control his lust. I'll help you, he murmured. Press down and take me inside you. He wanted her to have control over the pain of her first time, and he wasn't going to force his way into her. She put her hands on his shoulders to help leverage herself, and slowly let herself sink down onto him, the pain brief but sharp. Once he was fully embedded inside her, she leaned forward and kissed him. I feel so full. It's strange, she whispered, wondering if she was supposed to talk about it, but not knowing the protocol for having relations with her husband for the first time. He gripped her bottom tightly, wanting her to take her time to get used to him inside her, but not too long. He wanted to tell her to relax and scream at her to move at the same time. She felt so good around him, but it was an exquisite torture. You're so tight. Her eyes widened. Was she hurting him? She hadn't considered it could be painful for him as well. I'll get off. I don't want to hurt you. She started to move her hips and pulled mostly away from him, letting out a gasp of pleasure as he slid most of the way from her body. He pulled her back down onto him, shaking his head. No, it feels good. It feels, God, I can't describe it. So good. She looked into his eyes and realized that what she was seeing wasn't pain but lust. She liked that she could bring him to that state. Leaning forward, she pressed her face into his neck, nipping at it gently. I like how it feels when you're moving inside me, she whispered, embarrassed at the confession. Do I have to stay still? He groaned at her words, wishing she wasn't quite so innocent, but thrilled at the same time that he was her first. No, we need to move that way for me to spill my seed inside you. Her eyes widened with surprise. I didn't know. He smiled, stroking her cheek. Now you do. He moved his hand back to her hip and slowly guided her up and down, showing her the movements she needed to make to help them both find completion. Eliza was surprised by just how good it felt to having him moving in and out of her. Her breathing was labored, and she could feel something tightening in her stomach. She needed something from him, but she didn't know what. She moved faster atop him, wanting to reach whatever elusive feeling was just out of her grasp. Calvin held tight to her, letting her have her way. He kept a tight rein on his passion, not wanting to finish before she found completion. Watching her, he held her tightly as she threw her head back and panted, calling his name. He gripped her hips and forced her to move a few more times until he finished, his seed spilling from his body inside her. He pulled her closer to him, her face going to the crook of his neck and his arms holding her tightly. He was still inside her as he stroked her back, trying to tell her without words just how much she'd pleased him. She didn't know how long she sat with him that way, completely surrounding him, collapsed onto his hard body. Finally she slid upward, detaching herself from him and fell to the bed, lying on her side. Why didn't you tell me it would feel so good, she asked, immediately regretting the words. She shouldn't speak so freely, should she? He laughed softly. I had no idea it would feel like that. He moved down and pulled her against him, hugging her tightly. Thank you. Eliza kissed his shoulder, pillowing her head. She was exhausted. My pleasure. She giggled at her own words, not believing she could enjoy a physical act quite so much. Why, it was better than singing. Calvin held her close as she fell asleep in his arms. All he could think about was doing it again. Maybe he'd wake her early in the morning. She wouldn't mind, would she? Chapter 5. When Abigail came over on Wednesday, Eliza had a list of questions to ask the younger woman about how to cook certain things. Christmas was only a couple of weeks away, so she was thrilled to learn how to cook some more complicated dishes for her husband for the holiday. While they were talking and laughing together, Eliza asked, "Why don't you and Stanley come over for Christmas dinner? Do you go to church on Christmas morning?" Abigail nodded eagerly. I would love that. We could come over right after church, and I'd help you cook. Eliza loved the idea of spending so much time with the younger couple. As they sewed together, she sang softly. They each made an apron while Eliza sang, and she and Abigail chatted. By the time her new friend was leaving, she was sad that their time together was over. She hadn't realized how much she missed having other women around until she'd made a new friend, and then she wanted to weep for the years of loneliness. Abigail made her miss Beulah more than ever, because her sister had always been her closest friend. How could she possibly go for years without seeing her? An idea slowly formed in her mind, and she thought about writing to Elizabeth Miller from Beckham and asking if she could find a husband for Beulah. She wanted her sister with her. Letting the idea go, she shook her head, deciding that whatever happened would happen when the time was right. Asterisk. Before church on Sunday, Pastor Gibbons spoke with Eliza and asked her to sing at the Christmas service. She knew immediately it had been Abigail who had told him of her voice, but she shook her head. I'm sorry. I don't sing in public. She silently added any more. Calvin was standing beside her, and looked at her with surprise. You have a real pretty voice. You should do it. I bet you'd sound good with Christmas songs, and not just those old songs in other languages you usually sing. The minister looked at her in surprise. Old songs in other languages? Eliza smiled, not looking at Calvin. I'm an opera fan. I mainly sing arias around the house. She forced herself not to panic and to simply downplay her husband's words. Are you sure you won't grace us with just one song? Silent Night is my favorite. Pastor Gibbons was all but begging her to sing, and she felt that she had been given the gift, so she should use it for the Lord. He would protect her if she used it for His glory, right? Finally, she nodded. In a town the size of Poudville, there wasn't much chance that she'd meet up with someone who had heard her sing. Yes, I'll do it. She hoped she wasn't making a mistake. Calvin smiled and nodded at her, obviously happy she was going to sing a song he liked. She'll do the whole church proud, Pastor. She's got a beautiful voice. That evening as they had supper, Calvin asked her why she'd been reluctant to sing. She shook her head, tears springing into her eyes. She couldn't talk about it yet. Calvin nodded sadly, wishing whatever was wrong, whatever she was hiding from, she could tell him about it. He hated that she felt the need to keep her fears bottled up inside her. In bed that night, he held her close after making sweet love to her. I'm here to listen if you ever want to talk about what is frightening you, he told her. She shook her head and whispered, thank you. She trusted him as she'd never trusted anyone else, but Beulah and the boys were too important for her to lose them. Calvin listened to the words she didn't speak, feeling overwhelmingly sad that she didn't trust him with her secrets. He felt so much for her, and she obviously didn't feel the same. Asterisk. They opened their gifts before church on Christmas morning. She'd finished making his dark brown scarf and matching stocking hat. Both would help to keep him warm throughout the long winter. They were wrapped and on the table on Christmas morning. He opened the package and smiled happily, trying the cap on with the scarf immediately. These are wonderful. How did you find time? He was delighted that she'd taken her time to make something special for him, because to him, the hours she spent working on his gift showed how much she cared for him. She simply shrugged, her eyes dancing at his obvious delight over the gifts. She picked up her gift at his urging. It was small, and she had no idea what he would get her. She carefully opened the gift to find a jewelry box inside. The only jewelry she'd ever worn off stage was the wedding band he'd given her the day they married. She opened the box to find a chain with a pendant shaped like quarter notes. She looked at him in surprise. Did he know more than he was letting on? Or did he just know that she liked music? It's beautiful. Thank you. She turned her back to him so he could fasten the chain around her neck. Looking into a mirror, she saw that the pendant was laying at the base of her throat, and she loved how it looked. He was everything she'd ever wanted and so much more. She fell a bit more in love with him every day. When they got to church, she was surprised to find that she was nervous about singing in front of the congregation. She'd long since lost her stage fright when she appeared before others, because she'd done it so often, but these were people she knew, not total strangers. Her hand was shaking slightly as she sat beside Calvin in the pew, waiting for Pastor Gibbons to call her to the front for her solo. When the time came, she moved to the front of the church, and the pastor smiled at her. He made a brief announcement introducing her. For those of you who haven't met Eliza Simpson, she is Calvin Simpson's new wife. I have yet to hear her sing, but I have been told she has the voice of an angel. I couldn't let anyone else sing on Christmas morning. She's going to grace us with her rendition of Silent Night. Eliza waited a moment after the pastor finished speaking, expecting absolute silence. After all the opera halls and theaters she'd sung in, this small church should have been nothing. It wasn't, though. As soon as the first notes of the song rang throughout the small church, she saw people sit up straighter to take notice. There were a few gasps from people as they realized that she didn't have just a pretty voice. She had vocal training to go with it. When the last note had faded away, many of the congregation were wiping tears from their eyes. Eliza waited a moment before walking back to her seat, the entire building silent. Pastor Gibbons stepped forward. I was told she had the voice of an angel. That was an understatement. Eliza, you are welcome to sing for us anytime you'd like. Eliza inclined her head calmly, moving closer to Calvin and gripping his hand tightly. How had she been able to get on so many stages and not have this man to come back to when she was done? She rested her head on his shoulder as they listened to the sermon about God's love. Asterisk. Eliza and Abigail worked together to prepare Christmas dinner, each of them having prepared part of it before meeting up. Eliza had left the dinner rolls to rise on the work table, and the turkey was in the oven while they were at church. Calvin had gone out and shot a turkey just the day before because Eliza was so adamant that turkey was what needed to be served for Christmas dinner. She'd not had what she would consider a real Christmas dinner in years, and she'd gone all out to make up for that fact. They all feasted on the huge meal the women made, and the men talked while the women worked on the dishes and giggled softly together. Afterward, they all gathered in a circle and sang Christmas carols, Eliza's voice leading them all. Calvin's voice constantly hit bad notes, but she just sang a little louder so she wouldn't hear them. By the end of the long day, Eliza felt that their friendship with the other couple had been cemented forever. How could anyone doubt it after the beautiful day they'd spent together? Asterisk. It wasn't until he was just about to go to sleep for the night that the traveling salesman, John Turner, realized what had been so odd about the girl singing in church that morning. No matter where John ended up, he always made certain he was in church on Christmas morning, and he'd expected nothing from the service there in Pootville. When Eliza had gotten up to sing, he'd been amazed by the beautiful voice filling the church, and somehow it had seemed familiar to him just as the girl's face had. Finally, he understood why. She looked exactly like Langelina, an opera singer he'd seen several times during his travels. And her voice, yes, she was Langelina. He'd heard the girl was missing and her manager was looking everywhere for her. There was a reward for the person who found her, and it was over $200. That was a lot of money in John's world. Why, he could send that home to his family, and they wouldn't have to worry about finances for a good long while. First thing in the morning, he'd go to the telegraph office and send word back east that he'd found the missing opera singer. Who would ever believe she'd be singing in a small church on Christmas morning in Missouri of all places? Asterisk. It was mid-January when Eliza started vomiting. Every morning like clockwork, she was throwing up everything inside her. At first, she thought she was just sick, but she quickly realized that she was late for her monthly as well. She was pregnant. She didn't know whether she should be ecstatic or scared to death. She wasn't ready to tell Calvin yet. She wanted to wait until she was ready to tell him all her secrets before she told him about the baby. Soon, she promised herself. She'd tell him soon, and he'd be as thrilled as she was. She began making tiny little clothes for the baby, hiding them away when she was done. It was easy enough to hide her vomiting from Calvin, claiming she wanted to take off a few pounds and was going to not eat breakfast. "But you're perfect just the way you are," he protested. "I like you with your curves." Eliza just smiled and squeezed his hand. "I appreciate that, but I don't feel comfortable with myself. I need to take off a few pounds so that I will." She hoped he believed her, because she didn't want to explain why she was vomiting her breakfast just yet. Calvin shook his head at her. "What will be left to hold on to?" She laughed. "I won't get that thin. I promise." She was both elated and sad at the same time about the baby. She knew that she would never perform on a real stage again if she was a mother. She wouldn't ruin her child's life that way. Never would she allow her baby to have to deal with the stigma of having a mother on the stage. No matter how much she enjoyed what she did. "What are you doing today?" she asked one morning as she sipped ginger tea, trying to calm her heaving stomach. He looked at her with surprise. "I'm just riding fences as usual." She studied him carefully. "I'd like to come with you, if I may. I've never even seen the entire ranch." He seemed to think about it for a moment before agreeing. "I think that would be fine. Do you ride?" She shook her head. "No, I never learned how." "Could I ride with you?" She liked the idea of riding with him rather than risking being thrown while she was carrying anyway. He smiled as he thought about it. "Absolutely." 30 minutes later, she was on the front of his saddle in his lap, riding out toward the cattle. "What we do is just ride around, testing different areas for the fence strength. I want to make certain we don't lose any cattle to neighbors. It hasn't happened in a long time, but sometimes rustlers will come through and cut the fences to steal some of the cattle. We don't need that at all." When they reached an area where the fence needed to be fixed, they got down and she held the wires together for him so he could nail them down properly. Until that day, she'd had no idea just how vast the property really was. While they worked, she sang one of her favorite arias, her voice carrying across the entire area. Several of his men stopped what they were doing and rode closer so they could hear her better. He stopped her. "You need to stop singing. You're enticing my men." He couldn't explain the overwhelming anger that overtook him when he saw his men looking at her with admiration, not lust, in their eyes. She looked at him with shock. "Enticing the men? When I sang at church, was I enticing people there?" "No, but now you're singing in another language. It sounds like a siren song." He folded his arms over his chest and gave her a look that told her he was annoyed with her. "Are you serious? You don't want me singing my favorite songs because they're in other languages? I can tell you what the words mean. But it won't tell the men you're enticing what the words mean, so what good will that do you?" He knew he was being ridiculous even as he said the words, but she was keeping secrets from him, and they had something to do with her singing. He was sure of it. "Take me home, please. I want to be able to sing without enticing your men." She glared at him, angry that he would accuse her of trying to do something so ridiculous. "I'd have to leave my work for 30 minutes to get you home now." She was so angry she wanted to kick him. "I don't care. Take me home. If I take you home now, you'll never come with me again. Take me home." "Fine." He walked to his horse and held his hand down for her to help her up. She used his foot to step onto to get onto his lap again. Suddenly, she wished there was another place for her to sit on the horse, but she knew it was a silly thing to wish for. They didn't speak the entire way back to the house. He helped her down, and without looking at her said, "I'll be back for lunch in an hour. Because I had to waste my time bringing you back, make me something I can carry with me, so I don't have to take a break." She didn't agree, but walked into the house with her head held high. An hour later when he returned, she had 3 bacon sandwiches for him and a jar of water for him to drink. She didn't much care if he choked on his food at that point. She was fuming all afternoon as she moved her things from his room into the spare room down the hall. She wouldn't spend her nights with him when he thought she was trying to entice other men. He would learn just how much he'd hurt her. Asterisk. By the time Calvin got home for supper that evening, he was regretting his harsh words. He knew he needed to apologize, and he was ready to do it. Carrying his hat in his hand, he went into the house. He walked up behind her and put his hand on her shoulder. She shrugged it off. "Please stop touching me." He sighed. "Don't be that way, Eliza. I want to apologize for what I said." She walked to another part of the kitchen and turned to face him. "You can apologize until you're blue in the face. You had no right to say those things to me, and I won't put up with it ever again." She turned her back on him and continued fixing supper. He slammed out the door to go and milk the cows, angry that she was being so stubborn. He'd apologized for his temper. What more did she want from him? When the door slammed behind Calvin, Eliza sank into a chair and wept, burying her face in her hands. She loved him, and he didn't trust her. What kind of woman fell in love with a man who didn't trust her? She refused to talk to him as they ate, even refusing to let her eyes meet his. He could see that she'd been crying, and he wanted to make it up to her, but he just didn't know how. What could he do to make her realize that he knew he'd been an idiot? After doing the dishes, Eliza went straight up to bed, going to the room she'd moved her things into that afternoon. She was already in bed when she heard him stomping up the stairs. It took less than a minute for the door to the room she was sleeping in to be flung open and slammed against the wall. "What are you doing in here? Hiding from me?" Eliza propped herself up on one elbow and glared at him. "What difference does it make to you? You don't even trust me. This is my room now. Go to bed, Calvin." Calvin stood there glaring at her, his chest heaving for a long moment, before he left, closing the door behind him. He moved into his solitary bedroom and stared down at the bed they'd shared. How was he going to sleep there without her beside him? What had he done?